We're sitting right now with Barbara Ehrenreich, whose book is Living with a Wild God. This book came about first when you started to pull together papers for a collection for a university that was going to be gathering all of your papers, which you willingly gave them, you say in the book, except for one thick reddish folder. Mm-hmm. What was in that reddish folder?
Well, I knew it was there, but I'd pretty much forgotten about it. It was my journal from my mostly teen years. It wasn't a journal in the form of a book. It was the individual pages for each entry. Mostly handwritten, almost all handwritten. And I had been carrying this with me for, 30 years or more. I never looked in it, in my adult life, but it never left me either. I've always managed to keep it from one move to another. And I knew it would contain, record, refer to some incidents I had never ever talked about. And so there I was 59 or 60, and I came across this when I was going through my papers with a librarian, and I thought, I'm not giving that to any library. That's for me. And I sort of was kind of accepting to myself that I had a responsibility to my younger self to read this and to see what had been going on.
Yeah, there's a sort of a moving passage in the book where you read a portion of what you had written, and your young self basically challenged you, your older self,
yeah.
the person to read it. What are you going to do with this now that you have it? And you
well,
took
it
that
was
as a
also, sort of like, what your job is in life. I knew that when I was, 16 apparently, to find out the truth about everything. And so here I am addressing myself, the later self who would read this journal. I didn't know that it would be 30 years later. And she's saying to me, so what have you done? What have you accomplished? She didn't mean like, what degrees have you won or what jobs have you had. She meant on this project, the project of understanding everything. How far have you gotten? And I was like, oh, gee. That's pretty heavy when your teenage self reaches out to you over so many years and challenges you to not forget the things that motivated you as a child and adolescent. Because this is a society that has a lot of contempt for adolescence. Look at how we use the word. It's a derogatory word. Oh, that's so adolescent of you, And I don't. I take our child selves and our teenage selves seriously. And there's a lot that we put away in the name of growing up that we shouldn't. A lot of questions, a lot of curiosity.
Well, you in fact, the picture on the book is you as a young girl at the time that the journals were written, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But you give so much credence to that childhood self. A lot of people would push their youthful selves aside. You give a lot of credit to that young Barbara on the back of the book, even with your author photo.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that is me as a young woman. This is not me pretending to be young through photoshopping.
Yeah, that's right.
Or something.
That's right.
I take, I don't know whether to say her or myself, seriously. I mean, that younger self. And this, I think, has influenced the way I've been a parent and now a grandparent. I think of kids as fascinating young minds that have not been twisted and bent into conformity so that they'll see everything the same as everybody else does.
Mm-hmm. This is as much a memoir as it is about those pages, which we will talk about, but the memoir talks a lot about your own upbringing as a child with your mother and father, and it was not always easy. Your mother was difficult, your father challenged you, you looked up to him, you wanted to be him in many ways, but there was some dysfunction there. They were drinking, both big drinkers, and but that's a big part of the early part of the book, basically setting the foundation for who you are. Yes, and the good side of my parents, dysfunctional and often drunk as they often were, is that they encouraged inquiry. They were atheists, which is unusual. And they had, they were blue-collar atheists from this town of Butte, Montana, which was predominantly Catholic.
And I was brought up with that. We don't accept any easy answers. We keep looking. And you can ask any question. Keep going on it, you know? And that's great. So it was crazy, but it was also liberating.
You know, when you were growing up, obviously, though, there was some challenges, obviously, to being that person who you were. Yet from your journals that you provide, you clearly were thinking on a deeper level than a lot of kids that age are thinking. You were questioning everything.
Yeah, there's not a lot of what we consider teenage stuff in this. There's none in this journal. Or I had to dredge up through memory what some of the social contexts of these things were. Because the only thing I thought was important to record in my journal is my steps toward finding the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, you mentioned that you're atheist, that your family was atheist. You come from a family. You also tell a story, or I've read a story before about the history of your family's atheism. And there's the Mamie O'Loughlin, I think, is the name. Your grandmother, if I'm correct.
No, great. I think she was either a great or a great-great, and I've had trouble sorting that out.
Yeah, there's some great stories there, though, about how that all came about.
These were poor people, Irish immigrants, were looking to make money, you know, to make a living in western Montana, where there were lots of mining camps. Before there were mining cities with big companies, there were camps. And she lived in one of these camps. When her father was dying, she sent for a priest. Priest sent back a message saying it would cost $25 for him to administer the last rites. Well, that was unthinkable for these poor people. And then a few years later, she's dying in childbirth, and for some reason the same priest shows up, although he hadn't been called. And he starts to administer the last rites and put a crucifix on her chest. I don't know if that's part of the rites normally. But the story in my family is that with her last breath, she threw that crucifix across the room because she had totally lost all respect for the church at that point.
And with that backdrop of a history of atheism in your family comes the event at Lone Pine, or the encounter at Lone Pine, which is the heart of the book that you describe, and that was really at the center of that thick reddish folder that you saved for yourself. It's at the center of this book. Can you talk a little bit about what you experienced that day at Lone Pine?
Well, you know, this is hard to talk about, and that's why I didn't talk about it all my life until this book. You know, this is like coming out. I'm telling you what I've never told people before. I realized years later the phrase would be a mystical experience. I experienced it as an encounter with something larger than myself, I'm sure, but I would not say a deity. It was like the whole world had burst into flame. Everything was alive and flaming, and it was overwhelming. It was so overwhelming that it was shattering. I couldn't hold this in my mind. I couldn't.
And it was, the whole thing lasts of you walking and experiencing this cataclysmic event, as you describe it, lasted how long for you?
I don't know. I mean, probably the actual, you know, point of kind of the ecstatic, both in good ways and bad ways, encounter, you know, we're probably talking about minutes. I don't know, though. I had no watch. I didn't know what was going on. And then I kept coming back through that whole day, which we spent for some reasons which are very complicated, in Death Valley.
And you know, I read that section a number of times. I would go back and read it over and over again to try to get a sense for what it was that you're experiencing. These are, you know, and when, as you put it, you said that here we leave the jurisdiction of language, because I think it's difficult to even put it into words, but it was something fulfilling and bright and wonderful and deep and larger than you, obviously, and it was happening as you were wandering through this town at dawn. And you've never been able to explain it, but you tucked it away for all that time.
And then I got to a certain point in my maturity and thought, how come I am so scientific and curious about everything else, but this I hide? What is this? What happened? Supposing, all right, mental breakdown. That was my general theory for years, you know, some kind of breakdown. And I thought, but there was a sense of an encounter. and that the world was different than I understood it to be. I felt afterwards I didn't have to keep asking these questions about the universe, that somehow I knew, but not in words. So, big deal to try to put any of this in words.
Yeah, and even as a young girl, you felt like you had lived. At that point, there was
Nothing.
You had reached the end of whatever you needed to see.
Right.
Yeah. So as an atheist and as a scientist and as someone who thinks rationally and logically, as I read about this, you rejected some words like spiritual and other words, but something happened. But what is it about those words that don't fit or transcendent? Yeah. And the words, more than other people who might have a spiritual leaning or religious leanings, you really picked your way through describing with what words to use.
Well, I really thought about this a lot. My problem with the word spirituality and spiritual is it generally connotes something very pleasant and beautiful and loving. I mean, most people that I've talked to who say they're spiritual people, that's their sense. They've got something wonderful and soft and embracing them in the universe. Mm-hmm. What I found was not soft and nice or loving. Well, loving, hating, whatever. I mean, those are all human terms and do not apply. And so I think that spirituality takes out some of the mystery we have to address by using that word. And it also implies that there is no answer. I mean, so many people say, well, there are some things we'll never know. They'll just be mysteries. I say, no, I want to know.
So as a curious person who believes that there's, an answer, has this shaken your foundation of atheism at all, or are you still looking for the correct definition of what that was?
No, I have to say I'm an atheist because at first I would be kicked out of my family if I didn't, but also because there was no sense of a good and loving deity reaching out to me. Mm-hmm. What I encountered, if I encountered something, was terrifying as well as thrilling and rapturous.
So do you feel that you've done justice to your 15 or 17-year-old self with this book? You went out and reached out to old family members and did all sorts of things to kind of research what happened during those days.
That's a hard question. I mean, what if she says this isn't good enough? I mean, what if she says you missed the point? I don't think so. No.
Well, I also want to talk about the fact that as a writer, you've written about a number of different things. Nickel and Dime is probably your best known book, but you've written a number of really wonderful books. But it was a tough go to be a writer, and this is a memoir as much as anything else. And you write a little bit about when you were turning your papers over to the university. You were finding it hard to make a living as a writer, but you had already crossed that path to say, I'm a professional writer. What was it that made you say, I'm going to venture out, and that's my calling, I'm going to just make a go of being a writer? And how did you know that you could make that turn?
Oh, I had no idea that I could ever make any money. It was my decision to not be a scientist, and we're talking about experimental scientist, working at the bench. Mm-hmm. And I just wasn't that good at it. I mean, maybe I was good enough, but I'm not careful enough, I'm not tidy enough, and I want to read the results that other people find. Do your science, do the work in the laboratory. I'm an appreciator. There have to be readers for books. I'm like a science reader. I love that stuff, but I want to do it. And so then it was a matter of, what does somebody like me do? You've got curiosity, you've got some training in kind of what what you could call investigative journalism, just from science. And I loved it.
You wrote, there's a pamphlet that you wrote that sort of helped you cross over, it seems, in the 1970s, called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers. And you're an active in the women's movement in the 1970s, and that pamphlet seemed to bring you out a little bit into the world of writing. You took your activism and turned you into a writer, it seems.
Well, it did lead to a national magazine assignment, and but it took a while. Before I realized that that's what I had to put on my IRS form. Mm-hmm. That I have to put occupation in there. Well, I guess that's what I am.
Yeah, so much of your books are sort of helping other people understand things that are happening or providing your point of view on the world around them. This is a very personal book. It's about your life. It is about your parents. It's about the way you grew up. It is about a very personal experience you had in Lone Pine. That's a big switch, obviously. How has that felt, coming out and talking to people like me and others about something that's always, for so many years, been so personal?
Whew, it's hard. I mean, I am much more comfortable agitating for raising the minimum wage, or something like that. So this is just, I don't know. I don't know why you should be interested, but I guess if I have some kind of motivation, I think that we have to honor experiences that happen to us, even when they make no sense at the time, even when they're completely anomalous. Take that seriously. Don't just say, oh, there's an easy answer, like that was God. Okay, done with, sealed, off to other things. But, no, so it's about looking at the world in new ways and taking seriously what we find out.
Well, it's a fascinating book, it really is, and it's called Living with a Wild God. Barbara Ehrenreich, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great time at the Miami Book Fair International.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.